afternoon, Biolocity people that are coming to learn all about this amazing topic that we have with Kelly today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Kelly so that we can get started. For those that are not as aware, let's see if my screen wants to, about Biolocity. So, as most of you know, we are accelerating medical technology and trying to drive it to major inflection points to set it up so that research is not stuck in labs, but it actually gets to the patients, doctors, and clinicians. And we have a variety of things that we do within this, but one key component is the education component. That's what you are participating in today in this event. We do record all of these sessions and we do have a curated playlist on our YouTube channel. You can utilize this QR code. I will also have a QR code to provide to you or a link to provide in the chat. So I will put that in there as well. Now, a little bit about Kelly and her topic. So, Kelly is the CEO of Ascend Access Healthcare, which is a market access company supporting coding, coverage, payment, and claim strategies for new and novel therapies, which is amazing because we know that that is not a simple process. Kelly helps organizations leverage clinical evidence and commercialization strategies to improve patient access to care. Kelly is also the current EVP of Market Access Operations and Strategy at Priya Healthcare, where she leads authorization specialists and operational teams to align market access needs across customer programs, always with a focus on patient advocacy. Previously, she served as Global VP of Strategy and Market Access at Gensonics. Did I say that right?
Perfect.
Amazing. Okay. Advancing coding, coverage, and payment strategies across the US, the UK, Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands for innovative women's health treatments. So, as a reminder here, and I will also, as I mentioned, put these links in the show notes. If you want to make sure you become aware of events that we're doing and things that we put into the news, please connect with us and subscribe to our newsletter. And then you can also get additional information via our email here at biolocity@gautech.edu. So now I'm going to stop sharing so Kelly can start sharing and kick off her presentation. As a reminder, I will be watching the question Q&A portion. So if you have questions throughout the journey, please go ahead and put them in. And I'll either, depending on the question, Kelly, I'll either interrupt you then or we'll hold some of them for the end. And now I'll shut up and let you go.
Well, perfect, Angela. I appreciate it. Super excited to talk to you all. One of the fun facts here will be reimbursement can be as clear as mud. And feel free to throw those questions right into the chat and let's talk about them real time so that they make sense. So here's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, right? We're going to give you kind of like a high level overview. A lot of people use this word reimbursement. And I'll say one of the things you'll learn from me is words have meanings and right? Like I want everybody here to make sure that when they're explaining something that they're using the right vocabulary to maintain and gain that like confidence and credibility. We'll talk about billing. We're going to talk about the three foundations for coding, coverage, and payment. We're going to talk to like payment isn't always equal, how doctors get paid versus how facilities get paid. There's this whole thing called payers and what, right, like how do they enter into like the flow of money and how will people be able to buy and afford the technology that you guys are providing to them. We'll talk about what does documentation look like in order to make sure that those insurance companies or those payers say yes for each of the patients that you're trying to get your technology approved for. So most folks, I think today would say our healthcare system is a little bit challenging, right? It looks a lot like this, right? Like it goes in multiple directions and it can go back and forth. So like I said, about as clear as mud. My goal today is to take some of this and make it a little bit more predictable and understandable. The goal today is like introductory and happy to set up more time or partner with the group to learn more about this. So again, reimbursement as its own like word is only one portion of like very, we'll say broader topic. So the words that I like to use is healthcare economics and market access, right? Because that's really the broadest definition of all the things you guys are trying to do, Reimbursement is one segment of that that really talks about the billing process. So I'd say overall, most people will call me and say, I need help with reimbursement. And I'll usually be like, well, I think they probably need more than just the billing process. But I think it's fun to essentially go through like words and what they mean. I think if you talk to anybody in my area specialty within healthcare economics and market access, we're always going to talk to you about the same three things, right? And I actually have a fourth, which you guys are going to see on this next slide, but essentially coding, coverage, and payment are going to always be like the three foundations of any person that you talk to within the specialty. As I mentioned, words have meaning, definitions definitely matter. I put this slide in every single board meeting that I do, every single presentation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take a minute and talk about these words because like I said, everybody calls it reimbursement. What I want this group to know is kind of what are the foundations that go into healthcare economics, market access slash reimbursement. So the first one is coding, and we're going to jump into this today because it's actually a super big topic and it's probably the most foundational. So the simplest way to think about coding is it's a group of numbers that either explain what procedure, device, or even diagnoses the patient has. But this is the medical language, right? And so they don't write like that they have diabetes, but rather there's a diabetes diagnosis code. Right? If they had a procedure done like an EEG or an EKG, there's a diagnosis or like a procedural code to say that this is what happened. But it's really important to know that like coding in and of itself, really big topic, and different codes do different things. So we're going to unpack a little bit of that today. The second one is coverage, right? Coverage is essentially an insurance company either agrees or disagrees that your patient can have this, and they write what's called medical policy, meaning they publish it online and they say, yes, this is medically necessary. We agree that the evidence supports that our members that belong to Aetna, Anthem, United should have access to this technology or this procedure or this diagnostic. And so coverage is going to be really important in order to think about scale. Like, how do we make sure most of the patients that you guys want to get to the technologies can? The one that everybody loves to talk about, of course, is payment, right? And payment has its own like kind of like procedure, if you will, to unpack it. But essentially, we call it the flow of money, right? How does the person that's buying your technology get access to that money? They're going to go to the box right above this, which is the payer. So the payer in this example will say gives money to the hospital in order to buy the device to do the procedure that they're looking to do. But our job is to really understand how do different payment structures work? And like I had mentioned earlier, how a doctor gets paid and how a facility gets paid are different. So I want to give you guys kind of like a high level, like what to be thinking about when we're thinking about how to ensure, right? Like every stakeholder has alignment on how payment works for them. And like I mentioned, I have this fourth component in my opinion. It's probably one of the most important, but a lot of folks don't talk about it as frequently. And this is called authorizations and claims. The reason why I feel like this one is so important to the group is an authorization is asking that insurance company, right, in advance, can this patient have this? And then they get to say yes or no. But the thing is, if we don't ask them in advance and we just move forward sometimes with a procedure, then that whole payment thing, right, they don't end up paying for it. So a lot of times insurance companies require an authorization. They require an approval or pre-review of the medical need before moving it forward. The other reason why this is beneficial is before we get to a claim, before, Humana agrees to cover this for their 9 million covered lives, they might just look at a bunch of individual coverage decisions, and those would come from authorizations. And then last but not least is claims. So claims are essentially that like mechanism of how they get paid. So a doctor has to fill out paperwork, if you will. The insurance send it into the insurance company to decide whether or not they're going to get paid for doing this, right? And one of the things you want to monitor is you partner with physicians adopting your technology or hospitals is make sure that one, the claim is filled out well, that they understand the process. I know it seems crazy because this is what they do for a living, but I gotta be honest, I find a lot more mistakes than you would anticipate. But essentially, it's our way of inspecting what we expect. Like we expect you to get paid, but let's just check that claim and make sure that we did. So the big one that we're going to start with is coding. And like I had said, there is a number of things. Like it's not like a one word and it captures everything. Apologies, that thing just keeps popping up. Uh, so I'm going to walk through some of these. Now, some of these might apply to you guys, but again, chime in, ask questions. The way that I want you guys to think about it is everything starts with a diagnosis code. So an ICD-10 code, right, essentially says this is the diagnosis of the patient. The CPT, or the current procedural terminology, as it sounds like, defines the procedure. Every procedure has a code. Now, there's existing codes. There's like a big, thick book. It's put out by the AMA, or the American Medical Association, and they review these like on a consistent basis. And then there's new codes. Like you might not fit into a procedure that's already available. You might have something brand new. And so there's a way to create CPT codes. HCPCS codes are also put together kind of as like we also call these C codes. They're less about the procedure, more about the equipment. And there's two types of HCPCS codes, right? So again, it can describe a procedure, it can also describe equipment. And so this is managed both by the AMA as well as CMS. So again, there's some things to learn about HCPCS codes depending on what kind of procedure or equipment is required to do the procedure, or if these are done at home. And then there's labs and diagnostics, which also have their own types of codes. So as you can see, nobody on the call today needs to be a coding expert, but what I would recommend is, right, like really understanding and starting to navigate what type of codes you guys will need to know in order to make sure, right, like all those other things can happen. But by and large, a physician can't get started unless they, one, have the diagnosis code, and two, understand how to recognize your device or your procedure or your lab. So again, we talked about it. PLA codes, again, are lab like diagnostic levels, right? Blood work, there's procedural codes. And then the last part is within those HCPCS codes and ICD-10 codes, you have inpatient coding, you have outpatient coding. Inpatient coding is considered a DRG, or a diagnostic related group, i.e., what's the major reason that's keeping this patient in the hospital? Are they here for cardiovascular issues? And therefore it ranks and is essentially paid by this level of coding. Couple more examples here. Again, guys, if we just focused over on kind of this example, what I want you guys to remember is simply this. You guys will want to engage somebody to help me understand, or help you understand, right? Like, what is your ICD-10 codes? What are the diagnostics or like diagnosis that really needs to exist in order to make sure that it's, they're using your device on the right type of patient? A CPT code is essentially going to help us understand what was the procedure done. And then the last one is going to be, is there a specific thing that we need to know about with regards to the type of device? And so again, these are going to be like kind of the most common when we think about it from a procedural perspective, and really understanding, making sure that your device or your tool is utilized appropriately. I'm going to stop there for a minute because again, we jammed kind of like a super high level under coding, and just kind of pause and make sure if there's any questions that they want to throw into the chat around coding. Happy to stop here or go back or ask any questions. I know it's a diverse group, so some things might apply to others slightly different. And if we don't love asking questions in public, I'm sure you can share it with the Biolocity team afterwards, and we're happy to get you more information.
Kelly, I have a question just in this instance, and you may answer it a little bit later, but in the spirit of real time. So when you're thinking about new startup companies that are just getting started, okay, and where money is super limited and you have a small team, so you can't do everything at once. At what phase of the journey do you recommend that they really bring in a professional to understand codes, where they would fit within codes and the coding piece of it? And if you perhaps have any success or stories that are like, okay, there was this one company, ABC, and they waited until this phase, and because of that, they lost, access or something like that. Can you share any of that with us?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Great suggestion. So first of all, if it was me, money is tight. You guys are going to get this question from anybody looking to invest in the organization anyway. They're going to ask if you need to be a new code or an existing code. So I would hire somebody to help me understand, does my procedure or technology fit into coding that already exists? If it does, right, there's like, right, like we'll just call it steps that we can skip altogether and we can commercialize a little bit quicker. But I promise this is probably going to be one of those initial questions that you're going to want to understand. And then the other opportunity is going to be around like, do you need a new code? And if you need a new code, right, we need to go through an application process with that AMA or the American Medical Association in order to get started. I've seen it. We were just at this conference, so this coding is reviewed 3 times a year. Our last one was just in Boston last week. I'll give you guys a couple of examples that came up during the meeting, right? You guys might know Inspire. They're a huge medical device company, publicly traded. Um, they just changed their device by one thing, but it changed the procedure. And so they have like 2 leads in their Gen 4 that gets put in to understand respiration. They've moved it down to 1 lead. But because they made this one itty bitty change to the device, it actually changed the description of the procedure because the procedure code actually said that, right, it requires 2 electrodes. And so it had to be re-reviewed, reevaluated in order to let them move forward, right? And so what had originally happened, this is all public information, is they had to actually, when they made the change, they would have to use like a coding modifier, 52, that took the total price, what they got paid for using that code and cut it in half. And so Inspire now had to go back and say, hey, could we actually reset the levels of our codes or rewrite new codes in order to make sure, right, like we can maximize the value. So that's why understanding, right, whether it's a technology that's already on the market and we're making iterations, got understanding how coding affects them. Or the example, right, I shared in the bio that I worked with a company, Sonics. We had RF ablation for uterine fibroids. And right, so they had to create a completely new code. Had they not, there would have been no way to help physicians, one, recognize that the procedure was done, or number two, been able to get paid for it. So why is coding so important? It sets the foundation of understanding, like, one, how do we capture it? But number two, how do we get paid for it? So coding and payment are often linked. But I want to be super clear, they're not exactly the same. That's why they have their own little silo. You can have a code with no payment. You can have a payment with a miscellaneous code. Again, as clear as mud. But overall, I would say of these 3 things that I'm showing you, if you start with coding, you'll also get a good picture of where you guys could expect from a payment perspective. So again, I would tell you start early, waiting till later, even like an Inspire, right? It could significantly step back commercialization, just based on small little changes within your device. So I would tell you, make sure you start this process a little bit early, and highly likely that you guys are going to get these questions early on as you guys start to launch these and raise money for each of your organizations.
I love that example. That is spot on of what I've seen in industry as well. And so thank you for sharing that. One tiny question before we go into coverage. How do doctors find out about new codes? Like how is it set up within a system so that is it, as the manufacturer or the seller of the device, you bring in and you're showing them, here's the documented proof of the code, or what does that process look like?
Yeah, good question. So 2 parts to it, right? So I think the most obvious is once we've established that you guys either A, fit into an existing code, or B, we need to create a code, regardless, you guys will need to educate your physicians on what's appropriate coding look like. Now, again, we just make recommendations. Coding is completely the responsibility of the physician. So again, ideally, right, you want to give them educational material. They can choose to adopt it or not adopt it. The other folks that actually own coding in general is the American Medical Association. And so they do put out publications, they update EMR systems. And so again, coding does nationally get recognized. Like I said, it gets reviewed 3 times a year. But essentially twice a year, CMS takes all the codes and then they provide a value to all those codes, right? And sometimes the value is 0, just to be clear, but each one of those codes go through a review. So most recently, if you had anything that would in fact be used in an inpatient um, status, the DRGs like just came out. What are the new payments for every like DRG or diagnosis related group? And then in July, they'll let us know what they're anticipating or proposing for anything that's used in the outpatient. So if you're used in an ASC or the patient's just in and out for a quick procedure. So, right, like AMA controls all the codes. CMS essentially gives us the value. And those, again, can range anywhere from, you know, at least twice a year, depending on where your procedure is performed.
Amazing. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So coding, huge nut. I would say invest early. Know if we fit into something that already exists, if we have to go get something that's new. And then understanding, making sure that, right, like we also look at the payments that are related to those codes and how they'll work. But I promise you, whether you're selling to a doctor, the first question they're going to ask you is, what code is this? If you're talking to a hospital, they're going to ask you, what code is this? So I would say it's why we probably rank it as number one in healthcare economics and market access, because it is going to be the primary language that everybody's going to ask you guys about. The second thing they're going to ask you is, does anybody cover this, right? This is all of our insurance companies. And they're going to say, and I apologize, sometimes my computer freezes when I talk too long. Give me 1 second, I'm going to reshare. But essentially, the insurance companies are going to say, should I cover this? Should I not cover this? And essentially, we're going to talk through a little bit about what that looks like. 1 sec. And we're back. So the easiest way for me to help explain this is I'm actually going to start on the right-hand side and talk about kind of policies. So policy is a publicly referenced document. If you guys went on to Aetna.com and you wanted to know what is being covered for prostate cancer, they will have a whole bunch of policies saying what you can and can't have if you have prostate cancer, right? And it walks through each one of these. And then the other part that we're going to talk a little bit about today is the type of payer. So there's not like just one, but essentially multiple types. And the one question I want everybody to write this down today is, which type of payer is going to be important to your business? What do I mean when I say that? And I'm going to go, so sorry, guys. This is really freezing up. One of the questions I want you guys all to ask yourselves is, what age is the primary person that gets my technology? And that's going to be important because if we think about it from a government versus a, we'll call it younger patient population. And what I might just do is just blow this up so I can stay in this mode without freezing, if that's okay with the group. Is It's going to tell us what kind of payer is important to you. So essentially, I'm going to go here. There's two types. If we think about it in two groups, you have government payers, Medicare. If you have a technology or if you have a group that you're treating that's primarily over the age of 65, we want to make sure that Medicare, one, has that code and that payment, but number two, that they might have a coverage policy to say whether or not patients over the age of 65 can have this. The thing about working with Medicare is they really do ask more specific questions about their specific group. So let's say you did a study of 100 people, but only two of them were over the age of 65. Medicare might say to you, well, I need more evidence to make sure it works in our group. So again, understanding Medicare is really going to care about those folks that are over the age of 65. Medicaid, as you guys can imagine, right, is really going to be thinking about right, look, those folks that need additional assistance. The primary groups that we find in Medicaid are going to be women and children. Children actually make up about 60 to 70% of Medicaid. So if you have a pediatric, you're going to want to make sure that Medicaid policies and coverage are really well understood. And if you have a pretty broad technology that really affects multiple age groups, then we're going to be talking about commercial insurance. These mostly look like folks that are currently working. Their company probably offers them some level of insurance. That's what we would call commercial insurance. The one, we'll call it more gray area, is there's Medicare Advantage. It's managed by commercial, right? It's technically a commercial product. So Aetna Medicare in this example, right? It's technically managed through Aetna, but essentially the government gives, or Medicare gives Aetna a stipend to cover that patient on their behalf. So again, ask yourself, who is the most affected? Is it men, women, children? Is there an age group? Is there anything specific? Because that will tell you who do you need to start thinking about and engaging with from a payer perspective. All right, I'm going to try this one more time. See if we can get it to go. Nope. Okay. Apologies, team. All right. So, all right. So let's think about the way that CMS, right? And the reason why we focus on CMS is it is the largest payer in the country, right? Not only is it the largest payer in the country, but there's these things called MACs, and that means essentially they run the rules more locally within a jurisdiction, right? And so really understanding even if your population of patients that you need to reach are more uh, concentrated in an area, CMS will look at that, right? If they're, is it more Florida based versus California based? Because that will also impact the level of coverage that you're going to get through CMS. What they have is what's called local coverage policies, and then they also have national coverage policies. National, take the longest, think of end-stage renal disease as a nationally covered. Anybody with end-stage renal disease that's over the age of 65 automatically has access to whatever they need. Um, Other technologies that don't have that national bandwidth might be covered in, right, one of the jurisdictions within Medicare, but might not be in another. So again, a little bit of things that we want to break down if we're thinking about that. And the other way that I like to think about CMS is think about it like a law or a rule. Once CMS says that they cover, almost everybody else does, but it also lets you know like how challenging it can be to work with CMS in the fact that one, it's extremely large and that would require like a heavy level of engagement in order to get it because once it's set, it forces all those other commercial insurances, all the state Medicaids to make sure that there's access to the technology. So there's a lot of benefits in understanding how CMS can impact coverage overall. One of the most important things that you guys will see, and I would tell you to do this later today, assignment number 2 is going to be go on to Aetna or United or, any of Blue Cross Blue Shield and pull up a policy that's related to your disease state. So again, I think we talked about prostate cancer as one example. And what they're going to tell you is what is medically necessary, i.e., what is required in order to get access to this technology. As you guys can see, you got to have an appropriate diagnosis. So again, we want to make sure that that patient actually has prostate cancer. It's going to want to know what procedure code are you looking to try to have done. And essentially, it wants to know whether or not this is reasonable and necessary, right? Is it appropriate for this patient to have this, or should the patient have something else as determined by the payer? I would say this is like homework number, like number 2 after I've said, okay, coder, do I fit into something? Do I need something completely new? And I'll say, okay, what do I know about other things in my category in my disease state that are being covered and aren't being covered. And so understanding the medical necessity in any one of those policies is important. They're also all very public. Literally put in a Google search and you guys will be able to pull up policies, read them, and understand what these payers are saying about you, especially from a commercial perspective. I'm going to pause there because we're going to hop into payment, which is going to be its own unique category. But again, if we think about coverage, I want you guys to think about who's my group? Do I have any special delineation by age, by sex, by region? And then how can I do a little bit of homework to understand what do these payers already say about me, whether that's CMS is already saying about me, about Medicaid is already saying about me, or what's Aetna and Anthem and United already saying about me. These are great, just like introductory ways to get to know how does healthcare economics and market access affect, right? Like how your technology will be reviewed, and possibly approved.
So, Kelly, in speaking about that, in the teams and the companies that you work with, what are a few common misconceptions that people come to you, what they think they know of payers, they know of the process, that are some of the first things that you're having to educate them on?
Yeah, I would say if you guys only remember to do this one thing, you guys will get more payer coverage than, we'll say, anybody else that maybe hasn't had a chance to chat with me. The most important thing to a payer, everybody thinks it's like money. And I'm not going to say that it's not important, but I promise it's their last thing. It's not their first thing. The most important thing is the gap in care, i.e., is there 50 things that do the same thing you do and you're just as good as those 50 things? Or do you really solve a problem? I.e., right? I'll use the prostate cancer example. You have watchful waiting and then you have prostatectomy, very few things in the middle. And we're like, hey, these seem kind of extreme. Like if they're diagnosed with cancer, waiting doesn't feel great when you have cancer in your body. And yet complete removal also feels like maybe there should be something in between. And so, right, like a lot of those technologies now are really focused on like, hey, can we talk about this gap? Because we're kind of at two extremes. Can you guys think about what problem from a patient perspective that you guys are solving? And I promise payers are leaning in to really understand I have a gap. There might be a solution that hasn't been currently available, and we want to consider making that available, is number one. If you don't have a problem that you're solving, right, it's going to be really hard for a payer to want to cover this, right? I would say secondarily is think about evidence, right? So a lot of people come to me and say, Kelly, I got my FDA approval. I have this great study. Go win me Aetna. And I'm going to say, that's adorable. We should have probably talked before you went to the FDA. Because the way to really make, right, those investment dollars go further is I want your study to feed multiple stakeholders. So I needed to talk to the FDA and possibly CMS as well, right? And so the thing that I want you guys to think about is to make most progress with the payer. I got to understand the gap that I solve. And then number two, I have to meet a different criteria of evidence. And again, so FDA says safe and effective. Ours is reasonable and necessary, right? So there it's a different criteria that needs to be met. And so they expect different levels of evidence than they say just the FDA to say that you're safe and effective, right? They're going to say, that's great, it's safe, it's effective, but I might have three other alternatives, so I don't really need this alternative, or this alternative hasn't been around long enough, so I'm going to need some more time and evidence to prove that I should cover this. So the thing that I think most people, to answer your question directly, get wrong is they think because they got FDA approval that they're going to be able to win over payers. And the truth is, I would say by and large, that's not true because what the FDA is looking for and what the payers are looking for tend to be a little bit different. But I can promise you it's not requiring two studies. That's when I'd say they get it wrong. I'm like, well, now we got to do a whole nother one and spend those additional money. I'd say the smart ones come to us early and say, I got this new novel idea. We're talking to the FDA, right? What else should we be thinking about to make sure that, right, it gets approved, but we can leverage that same data, that same spend on creating the clinical evidence into, right, making sure payers will also adopt it.
I love this. So for the master's program over at Emory in Advanced Therapeutics, we do a lot of work with those students, getting them to understand why within an organization, each team, like each work stream, whether it's regulatory, manufacturing, finance, why they need to talk to each other. And I was just thinking of an example of to teams before going back to your Inspire example, thinking through as well before you decide to make a design change or before you maybe even do design lock, getting an overview and a review of where you are because it's much easier to make those changes and tweaks to set you up for success then than it is later. And how long is the process? So let's just say that, Angela, I have this company and I did exactly this, Kelly. This is a fake story, but I got my sexy widget done. I finished my clinical trial. I got my FDA approval, and now I'm trying to get payment because I didn't talk to someone like you. How long of a journey is it typically on average from that pace until you actually get acceptance from some payers?
Yeah, such a good question. And of course, in reimbursement is the worst answer we give, guys. It all depends. Okay, so let me give you that what that means. If you walk in to an existing code, right, then you already might have coding coverage and payment. Let me give you an example. I work with a company, Ceribell, and we did EEGs. EEG, right? The difference was instead of putting a ton of electrodes on the head, we had like a headband. So, but what we were measuring essentially was exactly the same. So we got to use the EEG code, which means I had a code because we're doing EEG. I had coverage because EEG has been around for a really, really long time. And we already had payment. So for those folks that are like, Kelly, I already got a code, I fit into it nicely, the AMA agrees, we're off to the races. Guys, you guys could launch with like what we would call the commercial foundation of coding, coverage, and payment. When I worked at Gynesonics, brand new procedure, right? Like intrauterine fibroid ablation under ultrasound guidance. That didn't exist before, right? So we had to apply for a new one. Then we had to create the clinical evidence to really share it with the payers. Again, for us, it took us about a year to get through that entire process. Um, and there were some advantages, though, too, of going through that process, which we got paid better by establishing our own code than we would have if we tried to fit into an existing. So again, I don't know that there's a one size fits all. That's why I'm like, start with your coding homework. And you might say, this code works, but I hate the payment because it can't cover the cost of goods. Or Kelly, my investors are really just not super patient. If I have established a whole new code, right? Like they might be very frustrated with that process. We can definitely do a round two of what's it take and what's the timeline to apply to different codes. But I would really say it depends if you fit into one, if we need a new one, and what's the pros and cons of kind of working within those. Because again, in one, you guys could launch with it. There's another thing that could happen though, just in full transparency. You could walk into an existing code, and it's not covered by anybody. So all these things, as much as they're interrelated, that's why I use the helix as kind of my symbol. They're also each individual. And so I would say, right, that's why we take you through this foundation, which is, do you fit into a code? Do we like this code? Does it pay enough? Is it currently covered? We kind of like do like a landscape to get us started. And then we kind of go from there.
That's amazing. And I'm loving the content of this so much because another piece of it for our early first time founders is just understanding, like you said, words have meaning, right? Understanding all of these things so that when you are talking with your investors, you can speak to things intelligently. Your investors won't know if you're full of it or not, right? They will know if you're ignorant. And the more knowledge you have earlier, then the more you can get them on your team and you can strategize about what you want to do next. So amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great milestone and it's a great benchmark, right? Like, hey, I need $10 million. This is what I'm going to do with that 10 million. I'm going to go get a code. We're going to make sure our clinical evidence supports getting payer adoption, right? Or, right, like I need 10 million because I'm going to hire my sales force because I already have coding coverage and payment. But you guys will sound much more sophisticated as a group in terms of like, why am I asking for what I'm asking for and what milestones does it get me? The thing I love most about what I do, honestly, guys, as much as I love coding coverage and payment, to me, it's really about the commercial strategy. It's actually making sure that your product makes it to the market and somebody actually gets to get it. But without these foundations, I promise you, I've seen great technologies never make it because we haven't been able to instill, right, like appropriate coding or coverage or payment to make that, essentially accelerate or adopted. All right. So now we're going to jump into some focuses, and I'm trying to be conscious of time because I want everybody to ask any questions that they have. Payment. All right. So I promise you the most common, hilarious questions I get is, Kelly, oh my God, the doctor didn't get paid and they're so mad at me, or the hospital didn't get their money and they're so mad at me. So payment really matters, right? And so there's a bunch of things, so to unpack when we think about payment, it's not just like, did we get the check and who's the check need to come from? It's really understanding that like payments are set up so differently based on a number of different things. So one is some people are paid on what's called a percent of charge ratio, meaning I charged you $1,000. My contract says that you'll pay me 80% of whatever I charge you. So you're going to send me a check for 800 bucks, right? Then there's this other thing where, right, like it might be a DRG, meaning I'm capped, right? Like this patient comes in, cardiovascular disease, I'm like really, really sick, but no matter what, you're paying me $10,000 for my entire visit, right? And so understanding how, right, like what site of service do you fall into and what kind of contracts does the hospital have with their payers? How will that impact their ability to buy or afford adding your technology? How it gets paid in the hospital is very different than how it gets paid in an office. So if you are used in the doctor's office, like point of care, right? Primary care, pediatrician, it's very different in terms of how they get paid versus how the hospital would get paid if you were like doing a procedure and they were staying overnight. So the thing that I would encourage us to do is really understand what site of service do you work within? Like where is your device or procedure done? And then, right, we can back into, okay, what are the payment mechanisms we really need to understand? Fun fact about payment is um, there is no one size fits all. Craziness, as crazy as it sounds, every single hospital has to contract with every single payer. So Aetna, Anthem, United, Blue Cross Blue Shield for every single service that they provide. So again, this is why I wouldn't make any assumptions on payments. But what I would use is benchmarks like CMS to say their average payment rates are X, Y, and Z, which are called fee schedules. And we would just say, hey, for this code, how much is this paying on average? Or for this, inpatient stay on average, how much is this paying? If a doctor does this in their office, i.e., how much is this paying? But what I really want you guys to walk away with is there's not like just payment in general, but rather that it's broken down into kind of like where and how payment happens. So one of the things we talked about, right, is the physician payment and then the facility payment. So this is really, I'm going to say, of all the board talks that I do, they struggle the most with this one. So I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible. If in my example, you are done in the outpatient, right? It's in the hospital, but you're in and out the same day, or you're in an ambulatory service center or an ASC, right? The facility, the hospital, or the ASC get their own check. And they're going to say, thank you, right? We did this procedure, and they're going to bill the insurance company and they're going to send them back money. The doctor sends them a completely different bill. If they work in the hospital or the ASC, they're like billed separately. So again, the thing to remember is the hospital gets one check and the physician gets the other when it's done in a facility. The only time this is not true is when it's done in the office. If the doctor, again, uses your device during an office visit, then it has a different, like the doctor and the facility get one check, right? And then like the doctor just gets a portion of that. But I think a lot of folks, when they start to look at payments, they forget that they actually have to look at both. You have to see what the facility is paid. I can tell you of the two, not to say that the doctor payment isn't important, but of the two, if the facility can't afford your device, right? There's no way the doctor can do the procedure. So that's why we usually start with like facility reimbursement. Like, hey, let's make sure the hospital can afford it and buy it. And then I would say secondarily, it's the physician payment, right? And so those are the two things that I want you guys to remember. Two checks. If the doctor is doing it in a hospital or an ASC, the doctor gets one, the facility gets the other. If it's done in the doctor's office, there's only one check and it's going to cover D, all the above. Essentially regardless of who is getting paid, right? The facility or the doctor, there's like four things that are always required. And you'll see, obviously, that coding thing is right here. So there's a document that they're provided, right? Essentially, they're going to say, hey, what code, what diagnoses, what procedure was done. They then submit that to that crazy payer that we were just talking about earlier. And then they essentially receive that payment, right? But essentially, there's a whole process that they go through or documentation. And these are the things. And now let's say it gets all the way to here, and we use my example where they call me and say, Kelly, the hospital didn't get paid, right? There's a way that we would essentially appeal this and help the facilities make sure that they make their money. Like I said, in order to help you confirm that they're going to get their money, best practice is that you're going to ask before you give, which is I'm asking for a prior authorization. Insurance company, Aetna, can Kelly have this procedure? When they say yes, great news, right? We move forward. The expectation of payment is usually much higher, right? And so you can ask for an authorization, a predetermination, a certification, or a pre-service review. In any way we possibly can, we want to ask the insurance company first if it is at all possible. Remember how we said which type of payer matters? The only thing that's interesting about an authorization is Medicare does not do them at all. So we cannot ask them for a prior authorization. But I promise if it's anybody else, you guys want to do this process. It's a way of protecting the patient, the hospital, and the physician for getting paid. Again, these are the three type, and for time purposes, I'll kind of go a little bit quickly. And then the last part is, again, if they don't get paid or they don't get authorized, we essentially get to fight with the insurance company to say, no, 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 no. You said that Kelly could have it, then you didn't pay for it. We're going to need you to do that. And they have essentially three levels that anybody can go to. You guys might have heard of like peer-to-peers. That's where a doctor might talk to an insurance company to advocate, like, no, Kelly really needs to have this procedure. But essentially, the first level is that authorization. The second is they said no, so that we either talk to them directly. And then the third is my favorite, is what's called an external review. And that's where an insurance company hires a like specialty to review my case, and they either agree or disagree that the patient should have it. But you can see where like fighting on a per patient level actually precedes, right? Like I jokingly say, like if I can get a bunch of wins, like one by one by one wins, then I'm much more likely to go back to that payer and say, hey, about, 80 out of 100 times you said that the patients could have this. Why don't we create a policy and make this so much easier for folks to get access to your technology? But the takeaway here is if we can ask first, we should try. And even if they say no after we get the payments, what you do have is the ability to essentially go back and fight with that insurance company to make sure that they get their money. The most important thing there is going to be around that documentation as to why this patient needed to have this particular treatment or procedure, in order to make sure you would need all three things, right? Coding, coverage, payment, in order to help make sure that we could more consistently help folks get paid, regardless if it was the doctor or the facility. So in closing, I now have 10 minutes left, but again, want to open it up to more questions. Healthcare system looks a lot like this, right? You got payers, you have hospitals, you have, right, like medical device companies. My job is to help you guys figure out the, right, like the flow of coding, coverage, and payment in order to stabilize commercialization. So I would say of all the topics, as crazy as this looks, it's probably one of the most foundational when we think about the opportunity piece successful in commercializing, meaning taking your great idea and actually making sure that it gets adopted by like the medical community and that it actually reaches the patients that you guys are looking to help. So I'll stop here and open it up for more questions. I know I talk quickly. I'm from New York, so I apologize, but happy to go back and talk about any one of those topics. And then, of course, bring in some additional information if needed.
Amazing. So as a reminder to the guests, go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. I will kick off with another question that I know you're going to start your answer with. It depends, and then I hope you can expand off of that. But when teams and young startups, let's take a device as an example, okay? When they are trying to put together from a high level a budget on how much money they need to put aside for the early stages of paying for a reimbursement consultant and starting that process, what do those ranges typically look like from a financial standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question. I think depends on how much you need to have done and how quickly, right? So you can do small boutique, right? Like just a one-off consultant that specializes in the area. They're gonna do, right, like probably an hourly. And then you have like large firms, right, that can like do all the above at the same time. So it just depends, right, like on what's your financial status and how quickly we need to move through them. But I would say we're pretty flexible, right, in terms of like, right, like a small hourly project, really be like, can you just figure out my coding? And that will lead me to the next ones. Or you might say, I want to like a complete review of over 100 slides of what's exactly my landscape for my technology. So I would say it depends, but you guys, right? Like I think if you take in the right order, which is that coding, coverage, payment, then, and like I said, coding and payment are going to kind of come together a little bit anyway. I think, right? Like you can get more with less.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think too, you can probably get more for less the earlier you get in there.
Yes.
Oh, because then at least getting, and we talk with a lot of our companies about this when we think about manufacturing and making sure what they've designed, a contract manufacturer can actually manufacture it before they get to this. And so I think the same thing earlier on, at least having a session where an expert like you evaluates what you have and at least can help you map out a reimbursement strategy that then you can feed in. Then, as you continue to raise funds, you can walk along that journey, right?
Angela, you said it best. Earlier is better. You'll spend a lot less money if we do it right the first time. A lot more money clean up aisle nine, right? Like, oh, now we got to reinvent or we got to change, right? And so to your point, I think the earlier, the better.
My second question is what happened? So, when you were walking through the pre-approval process for the procedure, and then you got to the denial part and the appeal process. So, in an example like this, if I have a device and the patient has gotten pre-authorization, they have the procedure done, and then insurance denies it, and then through all the appeals, it's still denied at that point, what ends up happening with
Yeah.
that bill and that relationship between the doctor, the patient, and the insurance company?
Yeah, a couple of different things can happen. So let's say they go all the way to the external, and unfortunately, the patient and the doctor lose. I gotta tell you guys, it's less percent of a chance happening. Doctors tend to agree with other doctors more than they agree with insurance companies. So I'd say if you can afford to go all the way to external review, you should do it. It's probably one of the best mechanisms that we have. Um, but essentially, most hospitals today, most physicians will have a patient fill out a form saying, if your insurance does not cover this, right? Like the patient would become responsible for it. Now, I got to tell you, I work a lot with the C-suites in a number of hospitals, and a lot of times they just write those off as well. So it really just depends. But I would say, right, the majority of the time it would fall back to the responsibility of the patient. And a lot of times, right, if, right, like you can advocate with that patient appropriately, then we also know that, sometimes the hospital will say, right, like we're gonna eat this one because we know we're gonna make it up on another one where, right, like the patient was covered.
Right. So that would cover the patient. However, it could cause problems for that company and that device for future use at that particular hospital and throw up a whole bunch of reviews in that situation, right? Which hence why that prior authorization process is so important.
All right. Guys, if there's one thing most people miss, it's that one. And I got to tell you, the difference between good and great is my companies that get the authorizations and they either in-house hire a team and like, or they hire an external team. But I'm telling you guys, it's the difference between good and great. And I get that there's an extra expense, but to Angela's point, the expense on the other side is never getting that adopted at the hospital or with that doctor. So to me, it's like, and you don't need it forever. If you guys did like a year of authorizations, right? Like it will set the tone, and then you guys have that knowledge. You don't have to do it 10 years later, right? I wouldn't even recommend it 10 years later, but initially, you're gonna save yourself a ton of headaches.
Oh, I love that last point that you did. It's because you're creating a new standard, an approval standard and process standard that is amazing. The other thing I just want to highlight about, and I will probably myself listen to this recording several times because I learned, you know what, I've been in the healthcare space for over 20 years and I actually didn't know what DRG stood for. And it never even occurred to me to look up what it was. So thank you for that. But I think the other piece about this is I'm hoping that those who listen and watch this learn some of this information so that when you're talking with the executives at your company and you need to advocate to focus on this, you can convey the long-term value of the company and the sustainability and how robust the company is going to be if you invest early on in something like this. So if you've given this a couple of times, but if people remember nothing from this presentation, but your couple of homework assignments, can you restate those for them so as they're entering into their day and into their next thing, they can start using their AI maybe Claude, since Claude has wanted to.
Yeah, I'm
Claude should
so
be
sorry.
sponsoring this. Now, Claude should be sponsoring this. I mean, it got a lot of free.
Really, I was like, oh my gosh, I should have restarted the computer. So I apologize for the technical difficulties. No idea why that was happening. But I would say, guys, if you only did one thing after you left today's presentation, go onto those websites. I love Aetna's the best because they tend to be super duper thorough and just find about what's happening in your space. What are they covering? And then they're going to tell you what they're not covering. And then they're going to tell you what studies they looked at. So it's going to give you guys like a lot of information if you started there just to learn about what's happening in your space. The next thing, like I said, if you get a certified coder or somebody that can look at to see if you guys fit into something, all you would need to describe to them is what your procedure looks like. And they're going to tell you, yes, this already exists. No, this is completely new. At least you guys would know which trajectory you're on. So those would be my two things that I would tell you. You can't start early enough to understand what's happening in your market, and you can't start early enough to know which type of coding you're going to need in order to be successful.
Amazing. And I am going to share my screen for everyone again to get those QR codes. I do want to announce that our next bench to market will be on, I should remember the date, May the 20th. And I'm going to give you that topic in just a moment. So Robert Turner will be presenting, and I really want this to see, you're not the only one that technology doesn't want to. Are you seeing my slide deck?
No.
Okay, let me try this one more time. So Robert Turner is going to talk on, here's where we go. There you go. You see it now?
Yep, you're
Yes.
good. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so on May the 20th at noon, the topic will be on early stage usability, reducing risk, and accelerating innovation. So I love, Kelly, that we talked a lot about reducing risk in this situation. And I believe, I think of regulatory and reimbursement are the topics that many of us engineers and scientists stray away from, but they are the cornerstone of advancing innovation. So I always say if you find someone on your team who's passionate about one of those two topics, to keep them because it will keep it front and center. So everyone in the audience, please make sure you register an RSVP for May 20th and reach out to us on our website if you have additional questions. If there are specific topics that you would like to see, we're planning out our next season, which will start in the fall. And we would love to hear from you, the audience, on what topics you want to learn the most about it. And to everyone, thank you for joining. For everyone who's now watching the recording, thank you for spending some time with us. And Kelly, we know you're super busy. Very grateful for your time and your wisdom today.
Thanks, teams. Best of luck and look forward to hopefully connecting again in the future.